Okay, Earth Explorers, we will go live in about 1 minute. Just gives you a chance for the affiliates to sign on and for you to get in the chat room. YouTube alerts are going out as we speak for America Free Radio. So we'll be live. Okay, Earth Explorers, we will live in about a chance for the affiliates to sign on. Very good. Chat room is working. Foxhole is on. D-Live is on. And we are ready to sign the studio on. So here we go.
Stardom were dashed by a panel of washed-up celebrities today as she received poor reviews from former MTV VJ Alan Hunter, Saved by the Bell's Mario Lopez, and Martika, who sang the 1988 hit One Tin Soldier. The 21-year-old Martin was despondent.
All I wanted to do my whole life is bring people joy with my Martika said
The panel was unanimous in its decision that Martin lacked stage presence as well as that special something it takes to be a star.
Wherever you are, make it T. Frequency Radio.
Here we go. Hour one. And greetings, Earth Explorers. Welcome to X Squared Radio. I'm your host, Brooks Agnew, coming to you live from an undisclosed location east of the Appalachian Mountains. This is where the past meets the future. In here, the results are always positive. We might go a little past your imagination, but have no fear. You will be safely traveling with us. Next weekend, I will be at Disclosure Con in Pine Top, Arizona. If you're anywhere close to Pine Top, Arizona, you should come and see us. DisclosureCon.com. You can go to my website, brooksagnew.com, and you can sign up for tickets. I think all the VIP tickets are sold out, but we're still going to have a great time, so we expect you to be there. We have a lot to go over tonight. Tonight is a special alert. So we are going to leave our YouTube affiliates on for about 20 minutes. Give a chance for all of you on YouTube to get settled in. But be aware that the other free speech platforms are right down here in the description. Okay, so when we sign off of YouTube in a few minutes, you don't have to miss any of tonight's broadcast. We cannot share the news that we have to give you tonight because Google routinely violates our civil rights and thus YouTube, and so we cannot allow YouTube to host our actual program. So we will begin with tonight's opening story, which is how dependent are you on electronics? You know, for most of the people of my generation, electronics are an upgrade for us, okay? We didn't have email when we were young. We communicated with each other the old-fashioned way. We wrote it down or printed it down, and we put a stamp on it, and we mailed it. I know that sounds so Pony Express, but, our lives changed as electronics changed. And I've often said that the smartphone really began the next evolutionary advance in human society. For you and me, it's we could live without it. We could actually leave our cell phone at home and everything would still function. We could still, go to the mall or go to the beach and we wouldn't have to be connected. We wouldn't have to TikTok everything. But for the next generation, the ones reaching 20 or 30 about now, it's hardwired into their social community. The range of acquaintances and sources for knowledge, easily recalled with a simple search term, actually changed the way human intelligence is expressed. When we were young, we learned through repetition. We learned our times tables. We learned grammatical rules. We learned history. We learned humanities and art through learning and through repetition, and at least the 4-6 grades in school were repetition, and we got better at it with each school year. We got our skills upgraded, our ability to communicate with one another, to understand one another, to understand the past and not repeat it. But the electronic world has changed the way that we store knowledge in our minds, because our mind has expanded to include everything we could search at a moment's notice. It changed the way that we handle crisis, and it changed the way we handle stress and even toxins to our communities. So what happens when the electronic lights go out? And this is where you really find out how dependent you are on this. We call it the Black Swan event. The Black Swan event of a solar superstorm directed at Earth could prompt an internet apocalypse, okay? We call it 10 days of darkness, but it could actually be longer than that. And it could be global. It could be global. It could be semi-global. It could only affect maybe half the globe as the, coronal mass ejection sweeps across the planet. It may only wipe out cursory electronics, maybe not the grid totally, but cursory electronics on half the planet. So University of California, Irvine assistant professor Sanjitha Abdu, and the last name is Jyothi, it presented the new research titled Superstorms Planning for an Internet Apocalypse. I'm going to cover this briefly. It was proposed last month during the Association for Computing Machinery's annual conference for their special interest group on data communication. It's called SIGCOM for short. And one of the greatest dangers facing the internet with the potential for global impact is a powerful solar superstorm. And this is not, it is rare, but it is not impossible. And although humans, our bodies are electronic too, but we're protected from these storms by the Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere, the radiation in the form of high voltage in the atmosphere will damage man-made infrastructure. And the scientific community is aware of this threat, with modeling efforts and precautionary measures being taken. But you can only go so far. Because now we're up into very high frequencies, 4G, 5G, and now they're working on 6G. And all this stuff is very sensitive. When we manufacture these things, and I'm in the high-tech manufacturing industry in a certain sector, we wear like a bracelet. And the bracelet is connected to ground because our bodies build up thousands of volts of static electricity on our hands, especially if we wear, latex gloves. And that voltage on us, it may jump from our fingers to a doorknob when we walk up to it and shuffle across, but it is devastating to sensitive electronics. So we ground ourselves out. That's how sensitive this stuff is. So the solar storm, we typically call it a CME, a coronal mass ejection. Now, they aren't like instantaneous. That is to say, when a sunspot collapses or a magnetic string snaps on the sun and these huge ejections go out into space, it's not like the lights go out in the next 2 minutes. It takes about 65 to 75 hours for that energy to reach the Earth. The light from it we can see with a telescope instantly. We can see it with our observatories. But the actual high energy particles that go racing out at several thousand kilometers per second don't reach Earth for about, as I said, 65 to 75 hours. Once those start hitting the side of the Earth that's facing the blast at that time, then the magnetized particles violently will jump onto any ground circuit that it can find. And a lot of those ground circuits are in very short length strips of metal on the printed circuits inside your equipment and inside all the sensors on the power grid and inside electronics in hospitals and airports and airplanes for that matter. So these large CMEs, they can contain, I know this is a little hard to grasp, but they can contain billions of tons of ejected matter, and this matter is in the form of very high energy particles. And when the Earth is in the direct path of a CME, now we're talking about, a rare event, not the coronal mass ejections from the sun, but the fact that they have to happen on Earth's side, and they have to be directed at where Earth's going to be in 65 to 75 hours. This is a rare event, but it does happen. I'm going to talk about a couple of those events. Now, according to Jyoti's research, power grids, of course, all the sensitive electronics that control valving and pressure and everything to oil and gas pipelines, that supplies natural gas to your house, it supplies gasoline to tank farms that fill up trucks that deliver to your local, Circle K or your 7-Eleven, and the networking cables, all the networking cables, except for fiber optics. They're the most vulnerable to these impacts of these high energy particles. And while the underground cables, which span everywhere, hundreds of thousands of miles all over the country, all over the world, and these are even more vulnerable than land cables because of their length. Okay, the land cables stretch, above telephone poles from place to place, but they're grounded often. They have a natural ability to truncate the damage, shall we say. But these long trunk cables, the ones that go under the water, the ones that go under your streets in your neighborhood, all your phone lines, all of your communication lines that go with these sensitive pieces of equipment, they're very long and very exposed. Now, owing to a lack of, we don't really have test data. We've never really tried a CME in quite a while to see if we're ready. All we can do is imagine. All we can do is, sit around. We call it a process FEMA. It means a process failure modes effects analysis. It's where experts in these particular areas sit around and say, what happens if this occurs? What happens if that occurs? What happens if this fails, this breaks down, this catches on fire, this gets attacked? And then they come up with what we call corrective actions for each one of those things, depending on what we call, we would explain it to you as a risk process number. We evaluate it mathematically. We look at the severity of the occurrence. We look at how often it could occur, and we look at how we can detect it. So we multiply these three numbers together to get a number between 1 and 1,000. If the number gets over 140, a lot of companies will put a corrective action in place. Some of them, if it gets over 200 or 300, they'll put a corrective action in place. And then, this is just predictive. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're absolutely protected against that, because it could still happen. It could still get through. Yes, I'm going to talk about that old dog, the Carrington Event. This is one of the older ones that we have as far as its interaction with electronics. Now, the research noted that the distribution and internet infrastructure it's very skewed when compared to the distribution of internet users. Okay, there are a lot more users than there are networks. And, we're talking about high latitude climates are more at risk than equatorial ones because of the way the thickness of the atmosphere. It's much thicker over the equator than it is over the poles, because of the way Earth's magnetosphere works and the way the ionosphere is built around the planet. We have holes, we have thin areas in our atmosphere that typically occur at not only high altitudes like, the Himalayas or places like that, but we also have thin places over the poles. Usually we have large, ozone holes over the poles for that very reason, because the flux lines work with the atmosphere. Now, the U.S. is one of the most vulnerable locations with a high risk of disconnection from Europe during extreme solar events. Intracontinental connections in Europe are at a lower risk due to the presence of a large number of shorter land and submarine cables interconnecting the continent. Meanwhile, if a severe solar storm does occur, probably Singapore would probably maintain good connectivity to neighboring countries. Cities in China, more likely to go dark than in India, northern hemisphere, because China connects to much longer cables. It covers more land. Australia, New Zealand, other island countries in the region would be at high risk of losing most of their long-distance connections. Locally, things might work. Intercontinentally, probably not. Now, the research warns that a collapse of the internet, even one lasting, 5 minutes, could cause devastating losses to service providers and damage cyber physical systems. And what does that mean? Well, the economic impact. That's what we're talking about here. This internet disruption for even a day in the U.S., just one day of internet interruption, is estimated to cost about $7 billion. Think of that. 365 days times 7 billion, right? You're in the multiple trillions of dollars a year that rely upon this electronic interconnectivity. And let's not talk about we will talk about the interconnectivity that affects life itself. Now, the likelihood of a solar superstorm hitting Earth is rare. It's not 1 in a million, but it's rare. Astrophysicists say that the probability of extreme space weather events, and we monitor these all the time. You can go to spaceweather.com. You can listen to Suspicious Observer, and you'll keep up with most everything. But we really think that the odds are between 1.6% to maybe 12% per decade. Not per year, per decade. But they could still happen. And so we should plan for it. But, whenever you're doing a process FEMA, you think, well, we could do this corrective action or that corrective action. But that corrective action is usually weighed against what we call the cost of quality. Now, I don't mean the cost of poor quality. That's a different thing. Like, what happens if this breaks? What happens if there's high warranty returns? Yeah, we think about that too. But for instance, if you're making an 8mm bolt, okay, you're making an 8mm bolt that retail sells for maybe 20 cents retail. And you figure out that you have a chance of maybe the pitch of your thread being off, let's say 0.02 of a millimeter. Normally it would be like you would have so many threads in like 1.25 threads per millimeter or 1.5 threads per millimeter. Well, what if it's 1.55? Well, you could say, well, that's a failure mode. So let's put a corrective action in place to make sure it's exactly 1.50 threads per millimeter. Let's make sure our tooling doesn't wear. Well, what if the machine or the detection system or the preventive maintenance that it takes to make that happen costs $50 million? Your bolt sells for 20 cents. You see, the cost of quality is also the cost of the correction of action to make sure that you're 1.50 threads per millimeter. So they don't do it because the cost is too high. That's what we're facing with the electronic industry right now. Drive around your neighborhood. I guarantee if you drive around your neighborhood, I don't care if you live in Irvine or if you live in Chicago, you don't have to drive very far, and you're going to find a little piece of property called a substation. I'll address that in a second, AB. And the substation is where your 160 or 200,000 volts is coming in on the high tension lines that are the really big ones up on the big towers. It comes in and it gets stepped down to about 14,000, somewhere between 13,000 and 14,000 volts. That's a lot of volts still. But they keep the size of the wire small from there to your local neighborhood where it gets stepped down to 440 and then 220, and then it comes into your house on two 110 volt legs. So you combine those together to run your water heater and your stove and your heat pump, and the other are 110 volt circuits in your house that run your lights and your computer and that stuff. If you go to the substation, there's switchgear in the substation. Now, a lot of this stuff is robust, costs millions of dollars. It will last for 50 years if it's built correctly. But all this equipment is managed, is monitored, is controlled by very small, delicate circuits. And if those circuits go out, the transformer can be damaged, the switchgear can be damaged, and the damage can be permanent. That is to say, that transformer, that $1 million step-down transformer has to be replaced. They don't have any spares. There's no spares because the cost of quality is too high. Now, some substations, like the one outside the NSA in Salt Lake City, or the one outside a fusion center in Virginia, I guarantee they have spares. They have backups. But not yours. Not yours. Your backup is somewhere in Switzerland, is somewhere in Germany, is somewhere in maybe even China. So when we face this, let's think about the actual events that happened. In 1859, as Old Dog correctly noted in the chat room, the sun blasted a CME at Earth. Well, we didn't know a CME from Shinola, and we didn't care about it. There are only electronics in that day were copper wires that ran along poles along the railroads to run the telegraph. And the telegraph was just a little click, 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 Morse code kind of thing where you could send a wire to somebody for so much a letter. And the copper wire was thick because in those days they used direct current. So it was like a big magnet that just ran, you made an electromagnet in second grade with a dry cell battery and a nail and a coil of wire, right? No, you didn't do that? Where'd you go to school? You didn't do that. My gosh, you should take those things out in the sandbox and collect all the iron filings. Come on. Anyway, millions of volts jumped on those wires, and they burned the telegraph offices to the ground. Well, it was no big deal. I mean, you just built another telegraph office, and you were up and running again. And then again in 1921, a solar storm driven by a series of coronal mass ejections triggered extensive power outages, caused damage to telephone and telegraph systems associated with the railroad systems in New York City and across the state. It was, in those days, about the most advanced city in the world. And then in 1989, notice we're jumping like decades and decades because, as I said, these are rare. A solar storm brought an electrical power blackout to the entire province of Quebec, Canada. That was 1989. Still no smartphones. Still not a lot of, electronic communication going on between people. Although we have, Sentinel spacecraft that can issue early warnings of a CME, it's going to give us maybe an extra 13 hours than our direct observation from Earth. Because, one thing about observing the sun from Earth, you can only do it during the day, right? But our days and nights, depending on what time of year, are about 12 hours long. It means about 12 hours we're in darkness. We can't see the sun. What if the CME happened, after sundown? We wouldn't see it if we're observing it from Earth, would we? We wouldn't know about it till dawn the next day. We might still see it in the sky, but by then the particles are on their way here. So we get about another, as I said, 13, maybe 14 hours of lead time because we have satellites. We have the SDO, the Solar Dynamic Observatory, that's out there watching the sun and sending messages to satellites around the Earth, which send them down to ground stations, and we get the news right away, and it goes out on your phone maybe as an emergency alert. And so the research pointed to increasing capacity in lower latitudes for improved resiliency during solar storms. Not all that is in place. The mechanisms for isolating cables connecting to higher latitudes from the rest of the submarine landing points to prevent large-scale failures, not all in place yet. We're more geared toward physical attack. Somebody shooting a bullet into a transformer, draining the oil out of it, or maybe an EMP, something like that. We're more geared toward preventing that than we are a solar storm. And the solar storm, of course, would be more devastating because it would get the whole face of the Earth that's facing that storm. Now, if a storm of that magnitude happened tomorrow, the question you need to ask yourself as far as personal preparedness is, how would it affect you? And many people think millions would die within a month due to their dependency upon this connectivity, and perhaps it would be wise to have, what a bug out bag is, right? Well, let's just call it a blackout bag, okay? So if you are at home and you're lucky enough to have a dialysis machine, you might want to have a backup generator. In case the grid goes down, you don't die, okay? Same thing with blood pressure monitoring or oxygen generation, those kinds of things you need to have a protection. Again, we're talking about the cost of quality. Do you want to go out and spend, $3,000 on a generator for something that only occurs once every 15 years? Hold on a second. We'll send TFR to its break. Okay, TFR is on break for 3 minutes. We are streaming live through the Truth Frequency Radio Network, which is a audio-only signal that goes out through TalkStream Live and to millions of people all around the world. They listen through iHeart and Orange Radio and TuneIn Radio. We have no idea how many millions of people are listening right at this moment. So we do go out through the Truth Frequency Radio Network, but we also go out through multiple video platforms. We go out through YouTube and Twitter and DLive and Facebook and Twitch and Foxhole. And then we also add Gab TV to that as well. None of this is free. We still have to work on equipment and software to get it all out there. But now we are going to enter our news phase. Not so much space research, but Earth stuff. So we have to say goodbye to YouTube because of the routine violation of our civil rights by Google. And so all of you that are tuned in on Google right now, we have about 20,000 subscribers. This is your alert right down here below. You can see in the description, there are other links. Lots of wonderful free speech platforms that you can go to right now, and you're going to need to do that. Because America Free Radio is signing off of YouTube right now because we're going into areas that They don't want to go. They won't let us go. So we're going to say bye-bye to YouTube right now. Goodbye. Good night, YouTube, and everyone else.